Hey, everybody, wait, we are in now. Sunil, let me make you a co-host here.
I can
so
do it
you
now
can
if you
Screen
want.
share.
Okay.
All right, thank y'all so much for your patience. I appreciate it. Hi, Sunil.
Hey guys, is that Jen?
Yes, you're the best contract guy ever. Jen, Hubble, boom, done.
So whenever you say, whenever you tell me.
All right, you should be good to go. You have Jamie, Lauren, and Rhonda in your Zoom, and you have Daniel. Ron, sorry, you look just like this. Lauren and Yolanda here in the classroom with you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks guys. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. My kids, Greenville County Schools, they graduated on Friday. So they're home. My wife's a high school teacher, so she is not done with work till Thursday, I believe. So anyway, I gotta be at home for the next couple days. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
What a great day you are.
All right, so bear with me 1 second. I'll just get this. All right, so today we're gonna go over the exclusive right to sell, which is Form 220. If you have questions, just jump in, and sometimes teaching on Zoom when you guys are live, I may not hear you. So if I keep talking, that means I didn't hear you, just interrupt me and I will answer your question. And we're just going over this one form today. So this class, just if you're planning, should be over in about 45 minutes, give or take. So by 1 o'clock at the latest. So let's get started. So a few basic things just about contracts. Make sure that you're using the right form. This is the exclusive right to sell. There's also an exclusive agency agreement, which is a different listing agreement in that it says that the owner could find the buyer on their own and they would not owe the brokerage any compensation. So you want to make sure to use the right form. So it's Form 220. You always want to go down to the bottom right-hand corner and make sure that you're using the right one. Just like I talk about when I teach the other contracts, the forms that we use are the SCR forms. Each office can decide, the broker in charge can decide which forms they want to use. We've chosen to use the South Carolina Association of Realtor forms because although they're not perfect, they are drawn up by our association. They have a lot of protections in there for us as agents, and it just makes it simple. So anyway, let's jump right in. So the first paragraph does basically two things. One, it identifies who this contract is between. This contract is between the owner. So I'll go ahead and type it in while I'm talking to you. So if I were listing my house, I would type my name there and Keller Williams Drive. In the second blank, if you are part of Keller Williams Historic District or one of our branch offices, you would type that office name in. But for most of you who are watching, Keller Williams Drive is going to be the company name that you type in. Remember that the form is technically not between you and the owner, it's between the brokerage and the owner. You put a time frame in there. Normally I do 6 months, and I think that's what most agents do, but obviously you can do as long or as short as you'd like. The nice thing about this market is if the home hasn't sold in like a week, it's probably overpriced anyway. So you could take literally a 1 month listing or a 2 week listing and you'd probably be fine. But normally I do 6 months. You identify the property that's being sold. So you're going to fill in lot number if you know it. Block and section, I almost always leave blank. I've never seen anyone fill that section in. You put in the subdivision, if it's applicable, address, tax ID number, city, zip, county. So pretty straightforward. So you're just identifying the property that the owner is giving us the sole and exclusive right to sell. Usually, is there a question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Form 220.
I'm sorry?
Is this Form 220?
It is, yes.
So we also use 310, or this is the form that, how are they different? Both.
Form 310 is the contract. That's the sales contract between the buyer and seller. This form is the form that you would use when you're listing property.
Okay.
Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
If it is one owner and two properties with two separate tax ID numbers that are right next to each other, would we fill out two separate forms or
I
can we
would.
add?
Yep.
Okay.
You could technically put both properties on one form, but I would do two, because let's say one sells before the other, or they decide to withdraw one but sell the other. So to keep it simple, I would do two separate listing agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Good question. So this section right here where it says the real estate described herein includes all improvements, fixtures, appurtenances, et cetera, if any described here, you can almost always leave that blank. You don't need to put anything in there. If there was additional property that they were selling with the home, like let's say you were selling a house on the lake and the seller said, I'll sell my boat as well. That's something that would be additional property that you can type in here, but more often than not, that space will be blank. All right, so paragraph 1 talks about the agency or the real estate brokerage relationship brochure and the types of agency that the seller is giving you and our brokerage permission to do. So the seller is always going to initial next to this first paragraph because it says that you've given them an explanation of the relationships that we offer our brokerage, and you've given them an explanation of the South Carolina disclosure of real estate brokerage relationships. Remember, that form should always be explained first at the first practical opportunity when you have substantive contact between you and the seller. So they're going to initial there, and in these next 4 places, they're going to initial 2 out of the 4. Don't have them initial all 4 because they conflict with each other. So the first 2 deal with dual agency, and it says that either dual agency will, they'll consider it or they won't consider it. And the next 2 deal with designated agency. And it basically says the same thing, that either they will consider it or not consider it. I always explain to the sellers that whatever they initial here, they're not giving me authority to do it. They're just saying they would be open to it. And if that situation arises, they have to execute a dual agency agreement or a designated agency agreement before we can actually do it. So all they're saying is, yeah, I would consider dual or designated agency. More often than not, sellers will initial the boxes that says they would consider it. Every once in a while, I've had someone say, I won't even consider dual agency. And if that's the case, that's fine. Just have them initial that first box. Paragraph 2 is pretty important because it accomplishes a few things. One, it sets the price that you're going to put the property on the market for. So you would write it out. So let's say you're going to put it on at $100,000, and then you'd also put it numerically. And then it also establishes what commission the seller is going to pay us if we sell the property. It can either be a flat fee amount or it could be a commission. 99% of the time you're going to be putting in a commission. So let's use 6%. So what it says is if you sell the property, the owner agrees to pay our brokerage a total of 6%. Remember that the owner pays the listing brokerage, and then through the MLS, the listing brokerage pays the buyer's agent brokerage. All right, bear with me one second. Let's see, someone's jumping in. It talks about a few other things in paragraph 2, which I'm not going to go into great detail about because otherwise this class would be longer than what we have time for today. But it just establishes when the fee is earned. Technically, it's earned and payable when they sign the agreement, but we defer it till closing. It also establishes a protection period. Normally, I put either 30 or 60 days. There's no right or wrong answer, but let's use 30 days in this example. It just says that if the property sold within 30 days of either the expiration or termination of the agreement to a buyer that saw the property while we had it listed, if they come back within 30 days after that and they buy the home, we would still be due the commission. A couple caveats to that. If the seller enters into a listing agreement with another brokerage, then the protection period is terminated. So that protection period is really there just to kind of protect us from a seller who, let's say like a week before the listing agreement is about to end, they run into a buyer who's looking at their home and they say, hey, my listing agreement's running out, in a week, come back in a week and a half and we'll work the deal out between ourselves. And then I don't have to pay, as much commission. So that's generally why they have a protection period in there. And that is page 1. And then at the bottom, they have spaces for the sellers to initial, and then you would also initial in the broker section on behalf of the brokerage. So any questions from anybody on page 1? Make sense? Okay, great. So top of page 2 continues paragraph 2, and it just defines what a sale is. So you can read that on your own, but basically any transfer of interest in the subject property. Paragraph 3 is important because it talks about how much the seller has authorized us to pay a buyer's agent out of the total listing compensation. So paragraph 2 says, okay, here's how much we're going to charge you, 6%. And then in paragraph 3, you're going to put how much we're going to pay a buyer's agent. And normally it's going to be 3%. So you would put 3% in buyer agency, and then you'd also put 3% in transaction brokerage. Remember, our office does compensate transaction brokers. We do not compensate subagents, and most brokerages don't compensate a subagent. So you can just leave that blank, because a lot of times if you're filling this out in like zip forms, it won't allow you to put 0 in there. So whatever you're paying the buyer's agent is what you put in this blank. And remind the seller, a lot of times they think that they're going to be paying the 6% here in paragraph 2 plus the 3%. So they think they're paying a total of 9. They're not. They're paying us 6, and we in turn are paying 3. Any questions about paragraph 3? Okay, great. Paragraph 4, I kind of skip over paragraph 4 because it deals with earnest money, and there's no earnest money when you're listing the house. So I just try to give the seller the information they need at that point as to not overwhelm them. So I just tell them, hey, we'll talk about earnest money when we get to the contract. And when you go through my contract class, we cover earnest money. Paragraph 5 just says that the seller's given us permission to put signs on their property. Remember that any signs you place on a property have to be allowed by the HOA. So a lot of like townhome and condo neighborhoods have rules around how big the sign can be, or if you can even have a sign in the yard, if you can only have it in the windows. So just make sure you're aware of that. But most neighborhoods, there's no problem with having a sign in the yard. Paragraph 6 talks about our duties to the seller. And basically what it says is we're going to use our best efforts to sell their property for the price and terms that is agreeable to the owner. It reminds the seller that we don't make any guarantee about the sale of the property. So that's, I talked about the protections that our association kind of sprinkles in throughout this agreement. That's one of them. Obviously, we're not guaranteeing that the property is going to sell, and we're not guaranteeing that the property is going to sell for, $100,000 in this case. It also reminds the seller that even after the termination or completion of this agreement, we're going to keep information confidential that we received during the time that we had the property listed, unless by law, of course, we have to disclose certain things. Paragraph 7 is a big protection for us. It limits our liability, generally speaking, to the amount of compensation that we're getting from the transaction. It basically, one of the intents of this paragraph is to prevent the seller from what they call like a shotgun lawsuit, where they just sue everybody in the transaction. Or let's say you referred a contractor to them, and the contractor did some work on their home and really just messed things up. They should not be suing you, us, the brokerage and the contractor, and saying, well, Sunil is the one who referred this contractor to me, so they're really responsible for what the contractor did. It just reminds them that, hey, we're going to refer different people to you, but we're not guaranteeing their work. Obviously, it's not a get out of jail free card either, though. Just keep that in mind. If you do something egregious, or if it's an intentional or willful act, then you could be held liable, and the brokerage could be held liable for above and beyond, compensation. Paragraph 8 talks about the seller's duties to us and to you, to us, meaning the brokerage, and to you as the agent. the big things I remind sellers of in this paragraph is, for one, they're going to give us complete and reliable information about the property, because whatever you tell me about your home is what I'm going to share with other people. So if you tell me wrong information, then I'm going to share wrong information. They are not going to speak with any other agents or buyers directly. So if anyone reached out to them and said, hey, I hear your home's for sale, their next step should be, listen, let me have my agent call you, and they can discuss everything. They're going to permit reasonable showings and inspections and things like that. They are not going to discriminate, obviously, against anybody based on all the protected classes. So, age, sex, race, creed, color, etc. Letter E, it says that they would permit us to incur certain expenses not to exceed a certain amount. I rarely fill this blank in because I'm not going to pay for a seller, if there's an expense. Now, every once in a while, you might have like an ad state seller or somebody who says, hey, you have my permission to fix anything that comes up on the house for less than $200. So you don't have to get my permission. If a small thing comes up, I'm out of state, you may not always be able to reach me. You handle it, and then I'll reimburse you. Like I said, we don't use that often because usually you don't want to pay, for a seller's expense. Let them pay that. It also says that the closing attorney is allowed to pay our compensation out of the proceeds of the sale. We have permission to list and publish the sales data in the MLS and in other places. And then continuing to page 3, remember at the bottom of page 2, everyone initials again. So at the bottom of each page, both the sellers and the agent have to initial. The top of page 3 continues paragraph, paragraph 8, and it says that we have permission to take photos of their property. And when I get to this part, and there's another section in the contract as well, I always remind the sellers that if there's any pictures that they don't want out all over the internet, like let's say they got family photos and stuff, then take them down before we do all the photos for the home. Because once we take pictures of the house, if you don't want your kids' photos showing up on the, on the internet, once we take it and we put it out there, it's going to be hard to pull it back because it goes on so many different websites, and many of them we don't have any control over. So just remind them of that. Some people don't want all their family pictures, out there for everyone to see. They're going to convey marketable title to the property, meaning that all liens and encumbrances are going to be paid off, and there's going to be nothing that makes the property or makes the title not marketable. It reminds them again, they can't deal directly with other buyers. So letter K, they have to refer any inquiries to us. They give us permission if the buyer or another agent asks if we have any offers on the property, we have authority to divulge the existence of offers. And remember, per our Realtor Code of Ethics, we have to get permission from the seller before we can disclose the existence of offers, not contracts, but offers. So this right here is where we're getting their permission. And if they wanted us to keep something confidential, then they would give us written instructions on that. So if we found out something about them or the property and they said, hey, we want you to keep that confidential even after this listing agreement expires, then they would give us written instructions. Obviously, we can only keep things confidential that we're not required by law to disclose. So like we can't, if we knew an adverse material fact about the property, even if my seller asks me to keep it confidential, I'm not going to do that. We only have to follow lawful instructions. Paragraph 9 deals with the seller's disclosure statement. And I don't cover this too much when I'm going over the listing agreement with the seller, because when we get to the seller's disclosure, I just give them a quick explanation on how that works. But basically, what paragraph 9 just says is that it reminds the seller that their obligation is to tell the truth on the disclosure. If they fill out the disclosure and then something happens to the condition of the property that would make a statement on the disclosure inaccurate, then it's on them to go back and change it. And it just reminds them that if they knowingly violate or fail to perform any duty described by any provision of this article, so meaning if they don't disclose things that they knew about and they should have disclosed, then they can be held liable. And they're also indemnifying us so that a buyer can't sue you as the listing agent or sue the brokerage because the seller didn't disclose something. If we know about it, we have to disclose it. But if we don't know about it, it's not our responsibility to play inspector and go, test the home, get in the crawl space, check all the outlets in the house and all this stuff to make sure everything works. Paragraph 10 just says that the owner is giving us permission to disclose information about the property to other agents and to prospective buyers. And they also give us permission if someone has a lien against the property, that person who's holding the lien, the mortgage holder, for example, has permission to disclose complete information about the lien to us. Now, here's the thing. If you contact a bank and ask for any sort of information about the seller's mortgage, the bank would need a completely separate authorization form. They're typically not going to accept this listing agreement as authorization, but it just lets them know, it lets the seller know that, hey, if in the course of us selling the home, we needed to get information about this, you're not going to not allow us to get that information. Paragraph 11 is really important if your seller is not a resident of South Carolina. If your seller is a resident of South Carolina, then this paragraph doesn't apply to them. But if they are not a resident, so let's say they live in North Carolina, they've lived there for a few years, and they're finally selling this house in South Carolina that they've been renting for the last 5 years, they would have potential withholding requirements. So South Carolina has a rule or a law that says that they could withhold up to 7% of the capital gains from non-resident sellers. So basically what I do is if your seller's in that position, I don't go into the details with them. I tell them it could be up to 7%. And I tell them they have to reach out to their CPA or their tax professional to get more information about what their tax liability would be if they sell the home. And in that situation, the closing attorney will also have the seller fill out this form that tells the closing attorney, here's what my gain was on this home. And then the closing attorney withholds 7% based on whatever the seller, tells them their gain is. So if the seller says, hey, I had no gain on this house, then that form, the closing attorney just takes their word for it. It also says that if there are rollback taxes or past property taxes or anything like that, it's negotiated between the owner and any prospective buyer. Property taxes are, it says personal property taxes. I guess if that were to attach as a judgment to the home, property taxes are always paid current at closing. But if there are rollback taxes, that's something that is negotiated. Paragraph 12 rarely applies to us because I don't think we have any property around here that's affected by the South Carolina Coastal Tidelands and Wetlands Act. So I usually just skip over that. I tell sellers that this listing agreement is used throughout the state, so they have certain things in here that don't necessarily apply to the upstate. It does say that if there's any surveys that are necessary, that's negotiated between owner and any prospective buyer. 9 out of 10 times the buyer pays for the cost of a survey if they do choose to get one. Paragraph 13 is pretty important. It's become a big topic since NAR rolled out the clear cooperation rules, and that's why they had to revise this listing agreement. So in paragraph 13, the seller can only choose one option. Okay, they can't choose both because they conflict with each other, and it has to be an initial. The sellers have to initial, not check. So option 1 is the normal option that you would have the seller choose if you're going to be putting the home into the MLS within the stipulated timeframes. Remember, with Greenville MLS, the house has to be put, or the property has to be put in the MLS within 48 calendar hours, not business hours. So 2 calendar days of everybody signing the listing agreement. So if I signed a listing agreement today at 12:30, it's Tuesday, I'd have to put it in the MLS by Thursday at 12:30. Now there's a second time frame you have to adhere to. Let's say you sign a listing agreement today at 12:30, and then as you're leaving the house, you put your sign up in the yard. So you put the sign up, whatever, call it 12:35. That's considered public marketing, and or if you posted it on Facebook, like as soon as you're leaving the house, you take a picture of the home and be like, hey, I'm listing this property or coming to market. That's considered public marketing unless you did it in our private Drive Facebook group. And NAR clear cooperation rules that were rolled out last year state that you have to put the home in the MLS within 1 business day of any public marketing. And if there's a conflict between the 1 business day and the 2 calendar days, whatever the earlier date is the one you have to go off of. So if you put a sign in the yard at 12:30 today, then it needs to go in the MLS by 12:30 tomorrow. If you hadn't put the sign in the yard, you could wait up to 2 days. Best practice is this: put the house in the MLS, obviously within the timeframes and as soon as possible. Don't wait, put it on as soon as possible. Don't sit on the listing. Don't try to capture a buyer by yourself and keep it off the MLS for a couple days in hopes that you can, get both sides of the transaction. Your fiduciary responsibility is the seller. And so put in the MLS as quick as possible. And then you're going to always check this first box that says that the seller does agree that the listing can be placed in electronic marketing mediums, including but not limited to, obviously, the internet, IDX, and similar, online services. So that's always going to be a check. Now, let's say you meet with the seller, they agree to list with you, but they're like, we're not ready to put the home in the MLS within a day or 2 days or whatever. For whatever reason, they might still be fixing the house up. They're just not ready to list it because, they haven't found a house yet. There's tons of reasons. The seller has to initial option 2. And once they've initialed option 2, what they're saying is the home's not going to be placed in the MLS just yet, really. It's going to be listed as what we call a brokerage exclusive, which means you can only tell agents in our brokerage about it. You can't tell anyone else. You can't post on public Facebook groups or on your, on your wall. You can't put a sign up in the yard. You can't send out a mass email blast, any of that stuff. No public marketing. As soon as you do public marketing, the home has to go in the MLS within 1 business day. Okay. But what this allows you to do is you get commitment from the seller that they're going to list with you before you start spending money, let's say on staging or whatever it may be. So I do this often. And then when the seller's ready to put the home in the MLS and everything's done, we just have them re-sign and do option 1 instead of option 2. They also agree by initialing here, they also agree that they're not going to do any public marketing. So they're not going to put it on their, neighborhood Facebook group or whatever. Now, the logistics of trying to, what's the word? Police what an unlicensed seller does. You might have a seller who says, you know what, if I want to tell my neighbors that the home's for sale, or if I want to put it on my neighborhood Facebook group, you guys can, pound sand, I'm going to do it. I don't know what GJR would do in that case with a seller, but we just tell them, if you initial this option, then you're consenting that you won't advertise it publicly. So any questions about paragraph 13? Because that's a question I see often about what's a pocket listing, what's not a pocket listing. We had a big discussion on our Greenville Realtors Facebook group about if agents can advertise their own properties, they can. It's their own property. So that's not, here's the thing to remember. The intent of this whole paragraph and all the rules and everything was so that you don't harm the seller financially by not exposing the home to the market and just getting both ends of the transaction. That was the whole intent. Obviously, if you own the property yourself, it's your property. You can do whatever you want, within the bounds of the law. So any questions on paragraph 13?
Yes,
Yeah, so we have a, sorry, I was trying to get her to type it in the chat, but Karen Flower has a question for you, Sinu.
Okay, go ahead, Karen.
It's just right up there on the owl. Just speak clearly and loudly.
Hey, Sunil, so we're
Hey.
doing option 2, and then when we re-sign to do option 1, do we have to sign a whole new listing agreement or just initial and date the change?
You can just initial and date the change. You don't have to go through and do a whole new one.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, and I would probably, in this case, I would put the time as well, initial date and time, because I've seen situations where someone turned in an agent, and when that happens, when someone if another agent reports you to GJR or MLS, Joe Pitts over at Greenville MLS will ask to see a copy of your listing agreement, and they want to see the times that people, agreed to it. So the time is important. So that's a good question. Initial, date, and time. Any other questions on paragraph 13 or pocket listings in general? Like I said, the big thing is, remember, anything you do should be in the best interest of the seller, okay? And more often than not always, but more often than not, especially in this crazy market, it's in the best interest of the seller to list the home and expose it to everybody. But once again, our job is to advise the seller of pros and cons. I just had a seller accept an offer. They initialed option 2. I didn't tell anybody about it. A friend of the sellers told their other friend. And so she called me and said, hey, can we come see the home? Blah, blah, blah. I said, sure. They put in a cash offer with very little contingencies. And I told my seller, I said, listen, now this is a great price. We could list it and it could go for higher, or you might not get as much and we potentially could lose this buyer. Probably not, but they could walk if you don't accept it now or within the next day or so. Long story short, for her, it was worth it to just take the price. She was really happy with it and not list it. The older couple, they didn't want to go through a couple days of showings, and we got some really good terms. They're buying the home. They're letting them stay in the home for free for a certain period of time afterwards. It's cash, no appraisal contingency, well above what I felt like the comps would justify in the neighborhood. So sometimes you have scenarios where it makes sense. Paragraph 14 is easy. Normally you're going to check the box that says owner agrees for a lockbox to be installed on the property. And here's another protection that the people who drew up this contract put in here. They said that owner further acknowledges that neither us nor the MLS is an insurer against the loss of personal property, and agrees to release us and the MLS from any responsibility. So if something's stolen during a showing, the seller can't come back and say, well, you know what, Sunil, you got to replace this gold chain that someone stole because you put the lockbox on there and that's how they got into the home. And those scenarios, unfortunately, do, happen from time to time. Paragraph 15 just reminds the seller that it's our responsibility to present offers to purchase to the owner up until closing or expiration of the listing agreement, whichever occurs first. And remember that you have to present all offers. It doesn't matter how they come in. Even a verbal offer should be presented. Now, a verbal offer should always be put in writing. But if someone called me up and said, your house at 121 Main Street, I would give $500,000 for that home. You have to present that to the seller. Now you can tell them it's verbal, so we really don't have a true offer, but that's up to them. You can't make that call. Even if the home's under contract, you have to present. Sometimes you see agents put in MLS that, offers have to come in on a certain form. They can't do that. You could write the offer on any form you wanted. Now we use Form 310, but if you got an offer on the simplified contract or any other contract, you have to present it to the seller. Now the seller could choose to counter and say, we'd like it on, Form 310 or whatever, but you can't withhold it. And you got to present it as soon as possible. Paragraph 16 just reminds the seller that we don't continue marketing the property after an offer has been accepted unless they want us to do so. I tell all my sellers that that's kind of boilerplate language. Once the offer has been accepted, we have to update the MLS, so the showings will pretty much come to a halt. But I still will tell people about it. We may try to get a backup offer because obviously in this business, it ain't over, till it's over. Paragraph 17 reminds the seller that our compensation is not something that is fixed or controlled or recommended by the board, association, any of that. It's negotiated. We have an office policy on what commissions are, but we're not required by any entity or state board to charge a certain amount. And they put that in there because I guess agents would say, well, I have to charge you 6%. It's the law. And I can't tell you how many sellers over the years have thought that, like they didn't even think it was negotiable. It's like, I thought you guys had to charge it. Paragraph 18, the seller agrees to maintain the property in reasonable condition. They warrant that the heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing systems are all working. Now, this paragraph is a little weird because technically, and we've had discussions around this paragraph with SCR legal counsel, you know, a seller could sell a home where the heating and air conditioning doesn't work. As long as they disclose it to the buyer and the buyer's okay with it, you know, there's nothing that says they can't. But this kind of conflicts that and says, well, they're warranting that it's going to be an operative condition. They don't have to. If it's not an operative condition and they don't plan to put it in operative condition, they can do that. And then what I would do is just strike through this and have, you know, you initial and date and have the seller initial and date. The other thing is this agreement is not something that the buyer sees. It's an agreement between us and the seller. The contract is what controls, you know, the agreement between the buyer and seller. Paragraph 19 just says that once we find a buyer for the property that contains the terms and conditions of the sale that are acceptable, the owner is going to enter into a written agreement. This paragraph is in here as another protection for us so that we don't spend 2 months trying to find a buyer for the property. We find someone who's willing to pay what the seller wants, and then they say, you know what, I changed my mind. I don't want to sell the property anymore. So it just protects us. Now, for practical purposes, if a seller doesn't want to sell the property, you're not going to make them enter into a sales contract. Really, the question just at that point is, do they owe you and owe the brokerage any compensation for the time and efforts and money that you've already spent? You know, kind of take that on a case-by-case basis. Paragraph 20, if the home was built before 1978, then the seller fills out a lead-based paint disclosure and it just talks about their obligations. Paragraph 21 is a mediation clause. You'll see that in most agreements where it just says, if there's a dispute that we can't resolve, then both us and the seller agree to try mediation first before we, you know, go straight to attorneys and litigation. Paragraph 22, once again, reminds everyone that the property is being offered without regard to any of the protected classes, race, color, religion, sex, etc. So we're not going to discriminate and the seller cannot discriminate. Paragraph 23 just says that the agreement can be faxed or it can be emailed, and it's just as valid and binding upon both parties as if they were original signatures. Obviously, nowadays, most documents are e-signed, not wet signed. So that paragraph is important. Paragraph 24, another protection for us, it says that the seller agrees that if we had to take action to enforce this agreement, then the owner would reimburse us for those costs. Obviously, they'd have to be reasonable, including incidental expenses, attorney fees, things like that. From a practical standpoint, very rarely are you going to sue a seller if they break a listing agreement. I've never seen it happen in 17 years. More often than not, it's not worth it. You might get some money. I've had situations where the seller says they want to withdraw early and I spent a lot of time, so I might get a couple grand from them, or, you know, whatever the situation is. Paragraph 25 is another protection for us that says that the seller understands that it's not my job, it's not our brokerage's job to go search the sex offender registry and obtain any information of there, or see if there's any sex offenders in the neighborhood or in the area, and that they can't bring a course of action against us for failure to do so. Same with criminal information. Let's say the home was ever used as like a meth house or, you know, a grow house or whatever. They used to grow pot in the basement. It's not our job to figure that stuff out. Now, if you know about it, you know, if it's a meth house, don't even list the property and get out of there. I don't care how much it is. Anything else, you should disclose it to the buyer and the agent. And if you have a seller who's not willing to disclose that stuff, then you don't have to work with everybody. If someone's not going to be straight up, I wouldn't even list the property. Any questions about page 4 or anything we've covered up to this point? All right. And then page 5 is pretty short, so there's just a few things on here. Paragraph 26 was something that was added with the last couple of years, I think last year maybe. It just says that the seller is conveying all of their audio, photography, videography rights in perpetuity involving the seller and seller's family and seller's property. This is what I mentioned earlier. I tell sellers, when we take pictures of your home, like if you do a 3D tour of someone's house, a buyer can walk through and see every picture, whether it's on, a nightstand or on the wall. And once we start marketing the home and put it in the MLS, that home gets sent out to, probably 100 websites, if not more. We can't pull any of that back. So if they don't want something showing up online for all of the public to see, then take it down. Paragraph 27 says that the seller is going to abide by any laws and regulations that regulate audio and video surveillance. This is a big one nowadays, because most people have some sort of surveillance in their home, whether it's like a doorbell camera, an nanny camera inside the house, whatever. So they have to abide by whatever South Carolina laws and regulations are. Obviously, they cannot tape people in any room where they have an expectation of privacy, so like a bathroom. And then they also have to agree to either give us permission or not give us permission to disclose potential surveillance as they deem necessary. I always check the first box that says seller agrees that broker may disclose potential surveillance. And then if I have a home that I know there's surveillance and it's not readily the buyer can't see it, I just put it in the MLS. As a buyer's agent, and I tell all my buyers, just assume when we're looking at a house that someone's listening to us or watching us. So don't say anything in the home or standing on the front porch or in the backyard that you wouldn't want the seller or the listing agent to hear. Paragraph 28, if there was another term or condition that you needed to write in that wasn't covered in this listing agreement, this is where you would do so. And then the last paragraph, it's in bold and it's all caps, and it just says that whoever's signing below, which is the sellers, warrant that they actually own the property and that they have the authority, obviously, to sign this listing agreement. It reminds them that it is a legally binding agreement. A lot of times I've had consumers ask me if they're in an agreement, or agents, well, how does the seller get out of this listing agreement? Or how does the seller get out of this buyer agreement? Well, anytime someone asks you that, you should say, listen, you got to talk to an attorney about that. I can't advise you there. But it's a legally binding agreement that they signed. They just can't choose to break it unilaterally. That's a conversation they have to have, with their broker. So remind them of it. It is a legally binding agreement. Sometimes I've had situations over the years where the seller's like, hey, can you just list it for a couple of weeks? And then if it doesn't work, we'll just rent it. And in this market, a couple of weeks is plenty of time. But years ago, I was like, no, I'm not going to, go through and spend money on marketing and advertising and all that stuff if you just want to break it after a couple of weeks, unless we work out some sort of compensation. But that's usually when it pops up. It reminds the seller that they could get further assistance if the contents aren't understood. So if they're signing this agreement, they're saying they understand what they're signing. And obviously, it's incumbent on you as the agent to properly explain what it is they're signing. Never just throw a document in front of someone and be like, here, sign this. Unfortunately, a lot of people do that. A lot of people sign stuff and then they're like, I don't know what I signed. You have to give the seller a copy of this. The best way to do it is to email it to them. That way you have a trail that you send it to them. And then at the bottom, the seller is going to sign date and time, put their email and phone number in there. And then you are also going to sign date and time on behalf of the brokerage. So you type in the name of the real estate firm. So like I said, Keller Williams Drive, unless you're part of THG or John's group is Keller Williams Drive as well. And then you sign date and time also. It's also important to get I always remind people, get the seller's email and phone number and put it on here. Obviously, you have the seller's contact information usually in your phone or in a contact management system. But God forbid, let's say something happens to you and the office needs to reach your owners. This is the best place for us to pull your listing agreements and say, okay, we need to let so-and-so know that, Sunil was in a car accident and he's going to be in the hospital for the next 2 days. And so if you need anything, here's the person to call. Along those lines, make sure you turn in your agreements to the office on time. So once you sign a listing agreement, I think it's 48 or 72 hours that you should be getting your documents into the office. Don't wait till you get it under contract and then submit everything. Because I've seen plenty of scenarios happen where something happens to someone. I won't say plenty, but I've seen it over the years where something happens to an agent and then the seller can't reach them, and we don't know about it. We don't know how to reach the seller, and it just, creates chaos. And then at the bottom, everyone's going to initial, again, just like they did on the other 4 pages. So that is the listing agreement. Anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
When we're sending our contracts into the office, is there like a specific email address that we're sending them to?
So that is done through command. That's a good question. Yep. So you submit it all through command, and you have your, I think they call it consultation docs, and then you have the contract docs, and then the closing docs. So you're submitting documents at 3 different stages of the process.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All righty, guys. If you don't have any other questions, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
I love your camera. Oh.
I actually didn't very instructions today.
Oh.
Hey, it worked. I've been going.
Good, yeah, it's mostly focusing on, brand stuff. Stuff like that, but. Yeah.
April's not doing her class today, is she?
No.
No.
So I did not find out, so a person was, no, Mary's not the other one.
Yeah.